Some stories are etched into the dust of the West. Tales of gunslingers and gold rushes that thunder like a buffalo stampede. But this is a quieter story, whispered on the wind across the Oklahoma plains. It's about a Comanche girl tied to a post with a sign that read, "Cheap Sale," and the one cowboy who chose to shoot the sign instead of the man who wrote it. It's a story about how liberation can be a prison, and how a single act of defiance can change everything. But what happens when the person you free begs to be put back in chains? Where are you watching this story from today? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in tales of honor and redemption, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories from the heart of the Old West. Now, settle in. The sun over the fledgling town of Redemption. Oklahoma was a merciless hammer in the summer of 1869. It beat down on the dusty main street, turning the churned mud from a recent shower into a cracked, pale mosaic. It baked the raw timber of the new storefronts until they smelled of pine sap and sweat. For Elias, it was the same sun that had bleached the life from the plains during his years in a blue uniform. A sun that held no warmth, only judgment. He led his dun-colored mare, Patience, down the street, his gaze low, fixed on the scuffed toes of his boots. The town was a raw nerve, a collection of opportunists, desperate families, and displaced souls, all clinging to a patch of land that wasn't truly theirs. He saw her from 100 yards away, a splash of muted color against the gray wood of the general store. A girl. No, a young woman, bound to a hitching post. Her black hair was a stark curtain against the buckskin of her dress, her posture rigid not with defiance, but with a terrifying stillness. Around her neck, hung by a crude piece of twine, was a freshly painted sign. The letters were stark and cruel. Cheap Sale. The air left Elias's lungs. He'd seen cruelty in all its forms, the casual brutality of the battlefield, the slow grinding cruelty of starvation on the reservation fringes. But this was different. This was commerce, a spectacle. Men loitered nearby, some chewing tobacco and spitting near her feet, others laughing with a sound like rocks grinding together. They weren't just ignoring her, they were feeding on her humiliation. A ghost rose in Elias's throat, the memory of a different girl, in a different village, her face a mask of terror before the smoke and gunfire consumed everything. He had followed orders then. He had marched, and he had fired, and the guilt had been his shadow ever since. It was a cold weight in his gut that no amount of whiskey could warm. He looked at the girl, Kiona, though he didn't know her name yet, and saw a chance to answer for a crime he could never undo. His hand didn't shake as it fell to the Colt holstered at his hip. The leather was worn smooth from years of familiarity. He didn't draw it fast. The movement was deliberate, almost weary, the action of a man who knew the weight of what he was about to do. The murmuring of the onlookers died as he raised the pistol, the long barrel rock steady. He wasn't aiming at the leering men or the smirking merchant. Silas Blackwood, who watched from the shade of his store's porch. He aimed for the sign. The shot was an explosion that shattered the afternoon's oppressive heat. It wasn't the roar of a gunfight, but a single, sharp pronouncement. The plank of wood splintered, a chunk flying off as the bullet tore through it. The sign, now violated and broken, swung crazily from the twine. A second shot, just as precise, severed the twine itself, and the sign clattered into the dust. Silence. The town held its breath. Elias walked forward. The Colt still held loosely at his side, a smoking promise. The men who had been laughing now found pressing business elsewhere, melting back into the alleys and saloons. Blackwood's smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Elias stopped before the girl, holstering his pistol. He pulled his bowie knife, its blade clean and sharp, and in 2 quick motions, sliced through the ropes binding her wrists to the post. Her hands fell to her sides, the raw red marks on her skin a testament to her ordeal. He expected tears, or a grateful nod, or perhaps a silent, swift departure. He expected anything but what he got. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide, not with relief, but with pure, unadulterated panic. Her voice was a raw whisper, roughened by dust and despair. "No," she pleaded, her hands coming up as if to ward off his help. "No, you don't understand." She took a step back toward the post, her gaze darting from Elias's confused face to the furious glare of Silas Blackwood. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Tie me back. You have to." The arroyo was a scar in the earth, carved by 1,000 years of fleeting water. Cottonwood trees, their roots deep enough to find the hidden moisture, offered a canopy of shade that felt like a blessing after the relentless glare of the plains. Here, the world was reduced to the whisper of leaves, the gentle murmur of a hidden spring, and the ragged sound of 2 people breathing. Elias had led Kiona here, half pulling, half guiding her away from the stunned silence of redemption, as Blackwood's rage began to boil over into shouted threats. She had followed, her initial plea to be tied back fading into a terrified, silent compliance. He offered her his canteen, and she drank, her movements jerky at first, then deep and desperate. He watched the way her throat worked, the way she clutched the metal canteen as if it were a lifeline. The raw marks on her wrists, where the ropes had been, seemed to burn in his vision. He had meant to sever her bonds, but he had only managed to sever her from a plan he couldn't yet fathom. "Why?" His voice was gruff, harsher than he intended. "Why would you want to go back to that?" Kiona lowered the canteen, her knuckles white. She looked not at him, but at the ancient, eroded walls of the arroyo, as if they held an answer he could never grasp. "It was a promise," she said, her voice quiet, but for the tremor running through it. "A bargain." Elias waited. The West was built on bargains, a man's life for a poker hand, a plot of land for a season's labor, a soul for a bottle of whiskey. But this felt different, darker. "Blackwood wants the land," she began, her gaze finally meeting his. There was no self-pity in her eyes, only a weary resolve that made her seem far older than her years. "The small patch by the creek, it is not much, but it is all the government left for my family. The soil is good. Water runs through it. He says it belongs to the town now. He has papers." She made a small, dismissive gesture. "White man's papers." She explained the cruel calculus of her situation. Blackwood had given her clan an ultimatum. They could cede the land to him peacefully, or he would have the territorial marshal evict them by force, branding them as squatters and driving them further into the arid, lifeless territories reserved for the Comanche. They would starve. But he offered a third option, a private arrangement born of his own particular brand of sadism. He said if one of us would pay a price of shame, he would lose the papers for a season. Kiona continued. He wanted to make a show of us, to prove we are nothing, that we can be bought and sold. Her chin lifted. "My father is old. My brother is too proud. He would have fought, and they would have killed him. I told them I would do it. I would stand there for 3 days, from sunup to sundown. At the end of the 3rd day, he would burn the papers in front of me. We would have our land until the winter." Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones, colder than any winter chill. He had seen her as a victim, a helpless girl needing rescue. He had been wrong. He was looking at a warrior. She hadn't been passively enduring. She had been actively fighting, using the only weapon they had left her, her own body, her own pride, his grand heroic gesture, the satisfying crack of the pistol, the splintering of the sign, had been a fool's errand. He hadn't freed a captive, he had sabotaged a soldier in the middle of her battle. "My family. They will think I broke the promise," she whispered. The warrior's facade finally cracking to reveal the terrified girl beneath. "Blackwood will not honor the deal now. He will take the land. Because of you." The accusation hung in the air between them, more damning than any bullet. The guilt that had driven him to act now twisted into a new, more profound shape. His past was a litany of causing harm while thinking he was doing his duty. Now, he had caused harm while thinking he was doing good. It was a bitter, choking irony. He looked at the splintered piece of the sign he'd unconsciously picked up from the dust, its crude letters mocking him. Cheap sale. The true cost had been anything but. He had paid for his moment of righteous satisfaction with her family's future. He tossed the piece of wood away as if it were burning his hand. He had to fix this, not for his own soul's redemption, but for hers. The sanctuary of the arroyo was short-lived. The first sign of trouble wasn't a sound, but a subtle shift in the air, a tension that made the hairs on Elias's arms stand up. His soldier's instincts, honed by years of ambush and pursuit, screamed a silent alarm. He motioned for Kiona to be still, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. Then he heard it, the distant rhythmic pounding of shod hooves on hard-packed earth. Too many horses, moving too fast. Blackwood hadn't waited for the marshal. "Posse," Elias said, the word a grim exhalation. "He's not wasting any time." Panic flickered in Kiona's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the same steely resolve he'd seen before. "This way," she commanded, her voice low and urgent. She scrambled up the loose scree of the arroyo wall with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat, not looking back to see if he followed. The land he saw as a hostile expanse of rock and thorn. She read like a map. Their flight was a desperate, breathless scramble through the unforgiving Oklahoma Badlands. The sun was once again their enemy, reflecting off the pale rock with a blinding intensity. Thirst became a physical presence, a scratching at the back of their throats. Elias, relying on his training, focused on the mechanics of survival, checking their back trail, listening for their pursuers, conserving his energy. But Kiona was operating on a different level. She led him not away from the posse in a straight line, but through a confusing, winding path that seemed to double back on itself. She pointed to a patch of seemingly barren ground, where she dug beneath a flat stone to find the moist, fleshy root of a yucca plant, offering him a piece to chew for its water. She showed him how to walk on stone wherever possible, leaving no tracks for their pursuers to follow. Her knowledge was his shield, his combat readiness was hers. A fragile partnership was being forged in the crucible of their shared danger. Twice. They had to drop flat behind outcroppings of sun-baked rock as the posse thundered past. So close they could hear the jingle of spurs and the coarse laughter of the men. Elias recognized some of them from town, ranch hands and layabouts who would do anything for a few dollars from a man like Blackwood. He watched their grim, determined faces, and knew this wasn't just about retrieving Kiona. It was a hunt, a blood sport. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, Kiona led him to a fissure in a low cliff face, almost completely obscured by a thick growth of hardy mesquite. "Here," she breathed, slipping through the narrow opening. "We can rest." The space inside was little more than a shallow cave, smelling of dust and cool earth. It offered little comfort, but it offered concealment. They huddled together in the growing darkness, the sound of their own ragged breathing loud in the confined space. From outside, they could hear the frustrated shouts of the posse as the fading light made tracking impossible. The sounds grew fainter, then disappeared entirely, leaving only the chirping of crickets and the vast, intimidating silence of the plains at night. They were safe. For now. Exhaustion settled over Elias like a heavy blanket. He watched Kiona, a silhouette in the faint moonlight filtering through the cave's entrance. She was tracing the raw, chafed skin on her wrist, a physical reminder of the promise he had forced her to break. His intervention in town, which had felt so clear and right in the moment, had led them here, to be hunted like animals through a wilderness that was her home and his purgatory. He hadn't saved her. He had only changed the nature of her prison from a wooden post in a dusty town to a barren wasteland under a star-filled sky. The darkness in the cave was absolute, a thick, palpable presence that seemed to press in on them. Outside, the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the Badlands, but within their refuge, the only light came from the ghost of memory and the faint spark of shared humanity. The forced intimacy of the small space stripped away pretense. They were no longer just a cowboy and a Comanche girl. They were two souls, cornered and exhausted, with nothing but the truth between them. Elias watched her in the sliver of moonlight that breached their hiding place. Kiona was tending to a long, shallow gash on his forearm, a gift from a thorny branch during their flight. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her fingers deftly cleaning the wound with a piece of cloth torn from her own dress, moistened with the last of the water from his canteen. The simple, quiet act of care was more disarming than any weapon. As her fingers brushed against an old, faded scar just above his wrist, a pale, puckered line from a long-forgotten fight, the dam of his silence finally broke. "It was called the Washita," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, seeming to be dredged up from a deep, bitter well. Kiona didn't stop her work, but he felt her go still. She knew the name. Every native person on the plains knew it. It was a name that tasted of smoke, blood, and a winter morning's massacre. "I was a corporal," Elias continued, his gaze fixed on the cave wall, seeing not stone, but a canvas for his ghosts. "Younger then. Thought I was serving a purpose, taming a wild land. We were told it was a nest of hostiles, warriors responsible for raids in Kansas." He let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "We rode in at dawn. There was snow on the ground, muffling the sound of the horses. It was a village, not a war camp. Women, old men, children. So many children." He paused, swallowing hard against the bile that rose in his throat. The orders were to eliminate all resistance. In the chaos, that meant everything that moved. I saw. I did things. He didn't need to elaborate. The haunted look in his eyes, even in the near-total darkness, said more than words ever could. "I saw a girl, about your age, trying to pull her little brother from a burning lodge. An officer. He just—" Elias's voice broke. He closed his eyes, the memory as vivid and scorching as the flames themselves. "I did nothing. I just stood there, with my rifle in my hand, and did nothing. Just followed my orders." The confession hung in the small cave, raw and agonizing. It wasn't an excuse. It was a testament to the wound he carried, the source of the profound weariness that clung to him like a shroud. He had offered her his past, his shame, expecting, what? Revulsion? Accusation? He had, after all, been part of the machine that had crushed her people. Kiona finished wrapping the gash, her movements slow and deliberate. She tied the knot, her fingers lingering for a moment on his arm, her touch neither forgiving nor condemning. It was simply present. She looked at him, and in her dark eyes, he saw not the hatred he expected, but a deep, ancient sorrow, an empathy born of shared tragedy. She had seen that same haunted look in the eyes of her own people, the survivors of 100 other Washitas. "The uniform is not the man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And the man I saw shoot the sign, the man who led me through the canyons, he is not the soldier from that winter morning." Her words didn't absolve him. They didn't wash away the blood or silence the ghosts, but they did something more profound. They acknowledged the man he was now. They separated the sin from the soul. In the shared darkness of that hidden cave, surrounded by the echoes of a violent past, their fragile partnership, born of desperation, was reforged into something stronger, a bond of shared, and perhaps survivable, pain. The silence that returned was different now, not empty, but filled with a quiet, mutual understanding. Dawn broke, painting the mouth of the cave with a soft, gray light. The new day felt different. The air was still charged with danger, but the oppressive despair of the previous night had lifted, replaced by a quiet, fragile resolve. Elias's confession had changed the landscape between them. His vulnerability had become an unexpected source of strength. Not for him, but for her. Kiona sat watching the plains come to life. She touched the small leather pouch that hung from a cord around her neck. Inside was a pinch of soil from the land by the creek, the land she had tried to save through her own humiliation. Hearing Elias speak of the Washita, of the blue-coated soldier who had stood by and done nothing, had crystallized a thought in her mind. Her plan to endure, to absorb the shame Blackwood dealt out, was its own form of doing nothing. It was passive resistance, a strategy of the defeated. It preserved life, but it sacrificed spirit. Elias had acted foolishly, perhaps, but he had acted. He had refused to stand by. And in doing so, he had shown her a different path. "We cannot run forever," she said, her voice clear and steady in the morning quiet. Elias was checking the action on his Colt, the familiar clicks of the cylinder a grimly comforting sound. He looked up, his eyes questioning. "The posse will still be out there. We keep moving west. We can lose them in the territories." "No." Kiona stood up, her small frame seeming to fill the space. "Running is what he wants. He drives my family from their home, and he drives me into the wilderness. Either way, he wins the land." She looked Elias straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "You did not break my promise yesterday. You showed me it was the wrong promise to make." The shift in her was palpable. The haunted fugitive was gone, replaced by the defiant strategist he had first glimpsed. But now, her strategy had changed. It was no longer about endurance. It was about confrontation. "We ride back," she declared. Elias stared at her, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. "Back to redemption? Kiona, that's suicide. Blackwood has the whole town in his pocket. It will be a hornet's nest." "A hornet's nest is only dangerous if you stumble into it," she countered, a flicker of her father's wisdom in her words. "We will walk in through the front gate. You shot his sign. Now I will speak my truth. A story is stronger than a rope." A slow smile touched Elias's lips, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. He saw the beautiful, terrible logic of it. They had been the hunted. Now, they would become the hunters. His redemption wasn't to be found in running or hiding her away. It was to be found by standing beside her, lending his strength to her cause, becoming the man who did not stand by while injustice was done. His past as a soldier had taught him how to fight. Now, Kiona was teaching him what to fight for. "All right," he said, his voice imbued with a new purpose. He holstered his pistol and stood to face her, no longer a weary drifter, but an ally. "We ride back." Their journey back was the reverse of their desperate flight. They no longer sought the winding, hidden paths. They rode with a direct and unnerving purpose, their posture straight, their eyes fixed on the eastern horizon. The badlands they had fled through now seemed smaller, less intimidating. They were no longer running from a threat. They were riding toward a reckoning. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, they saw it in the distance, the dusty, raw outline of redemption. It was not a sanctuary or a destination. It was a battlefield, and they were riding willingly into the heart of it. Riding back into redemption was like walking into a room that had gone silent moments before you entered. The air was thick with wary eyes and unspoken questions as Elias and Kiona proceeded down the main street, leading their horses. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. The men who had loitered and laughed 2 days ago now watched from the shadows of overhangs, their expressions a mixture of fear and grudging respect. The story of the cowboy who shot the sign had clearly grown in the telling. Their return, bold and in broad daylight, was an act of defiance no one had expected. They walked past the hitching post where Kiona had been bound. A few splinters of pale wood from the shattered sign still lay in the dust, a small monument to the moment everything changed. Elias felt a tremor in his hand, a ghost of the recoil from his Colt, but he kept his gaze steady. They didn't head for the sheriff's office. They headed for the one place that served as the town's heart and its rotten core, Silas Blackwood's general store and saloon. Blackwood was inside, holding court at the bar, a whiskey in his hand. The laughter of his cronies died the moment Elias and Kiona stepped through the swinging doors. The saloon fell silent, the air suddenly close and smelling of stale beer and fear. Blackwood turned slowly, a look of theatrical surprise on his face that quickly hardened into a predator's sneer. "Well, look what the cat dragged in, the runaway pet and her white knight. I trust you enjoyed your time in the wilderness." Elias's hand rested on the worn leather of his holster, but he made no move. This was Kiona's stage. She stepped forward, her head held high, her voice, though not loud, carried to every corner of the silent room, clear and sharp as glass. "I am Kiona of the Numunu," she began, using the name for her own people, "and I have not run from anything." She looked not at Blackwood, but at the faces of the townspeople ranged around the room, the blacksmith, the stable owner, the homesteaders who traded at Blackwood's store. 2 days ago, I made a bargain with this man, she said, pointing a steady finger at Blackwood. I agreed to stand in shame so my family could keep the small piece of land the treaty promised us. My shame for their survival. He gave his word. A murmur went through the crowd. They had seen the spectacle, but few knew the reason behind it. This man, Kiona continued, her gaze now locking with Blackwood's, breaks his promises. He preys on the weak because he is a coward. He uses paper and threats because he has no honor. She then turned her attention back to the onlookers. He chokes this town. He owns your debts. He holds your futures in his ledger. The same way he tried to hold my family's. Your silence is the rope he uses to bind all of you. It was a master stroke. She wasn't just pleading her case. She was holding up a mirror to the entire town, showing them their own complicity, their own quiet servitude. Blackwood slammed his glass on the bar. Lies. She's a savage, spinning tales to save her thieving family. And you, he snarled, turning on Elias. You're a wanted man for interfering with lawful business. Show me the law. Blackwood, Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. Show me the town ordinance that allows for the public humiliation and binding of a woman for a private debt. I'm sure the territorial marshal in Fort Sill would be very interested to see it. He let the name hang in the air, a reminder that redemption was not an island, that there were powers greater than Silas Blackwood. The standoff was absolute. It was no longer about a single Comanche girl. It was about the soul of the town. The townspeople looked from Kiona's proud, defiant face to Blackwood's twisted mask of rage, and for the first time, they were forced to choose. The fear of Blackwood was a familiar weight, but the shame of their own silence, now laid bare by Kiona's courage, was a new and sharper pain. The tension stretched taut, thin as a wire, ready to snap. Blackwood's hand twitched, his eyes darting to the two hired guns who stood beside him. The time for words was over. The snap, when it came, was not a gunshot, but the scraping of a chair. One of Blackwood's men, a hulking brute with dull eyes, made his move. But Elias had been waiting for it. He wasn't the haunted soldier from the Washita anymore. He was a man with a singular purpose, and his actions were clean, precise, and brutally efficient. He didn't draw his gun. In a motion too fast to follow, he stepped forward and drove the heel of his palm into the man's throat. The brute gagged, his eyes wide with shock, and stumbled backward into a table, collapsing in a heap of splintered wood and choking noises. The second gunman, startled, fumbled for his pistol. That was the only opening Elias needed. He closed the distance, his left hand slapping the man's gun arm aside, while his right delivered a solid, cracking blow to the jaw. The man's head snapped back, and he crumpled to the floorboards, unconscious before he landed. The entire exchange took less than 5 seconds. It wasn't a brawl. It was a surgical removal of threats, a display of skill honed in 100 desperate situations, now used not to take a life, but to protect one. The saloon was frozen in a state of collective shock, but the fight wasn't over. Blackwood, his face purple with rage, abandoned all pretense of authority and lunged for the shotgun he kept behind the bar. This was the moment Elias had feared, the moment raw power replaced manipulation. He finally drew his Colt, the hammer clicking back with a sound that was both a promise and a finality. But before he could aim, Kiona acted. She was no longer a victim or a symbol. She was an agent of her own fate. While all eyes were on Elias and the gunman, she had moved with quiet purpose toward the end of the bar. With a powerful shove, she sent a tall stack of dusty whiskey crates crashing down directly in Blackwood's path. He roared in frustration as he was buried in the avalanche of wood and shattering glass, the shotgun clattering uselessly from his grasp. It was that act, her act, that truly sealed his fate. The momentary distraction gave the town's sheriff, a man who had been paralyzed by indecision, the courage he needed. He drew his own pistol, its barrel leveled squarely at the sputtering, furious merchant. "Silas Blackwood," the sheriff said, his voice finally finding its authority. "I'm placing you under arrest for unlawful coercion, assault, and about a dozen other things I reckon I can make stick." The tension broke. The townspeople, who had been statues of fear, suddenly came alive. One man helped the sheriff secure the struggling Blackwood. Another tended to the unconscious gunman. They were no longer passive observers. Kiona's courage and Elias's stand had broken the spell. Elias holstered his Colt, his breathing evening out. He looked at Kiona, who stood amidst the debris, her chest heaving slightly, her eyes blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with hate and everything to do with a spirit that would not be broken. She had not waited to be rescued. She had made a bold move, not with a weapon, but with cleverness and courage, and in doing so had freed not just herself, but the entire town. He had started this by shooting a sign, but she had finished it by refusing to be a symbol any longer. Their gazes met across the wrecked saloon, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They were not a hero and a damsel. They were survivors, equals, and together, they had found not just justice, but a quiet, hard-won peace. In the days that followed, a quiet change settled over redemption. With Blackwood's ledgers seized and his reign of fear broken, the town seemed to take its first, clean breath. The air felt lighter. People spoke to each other in the street, their eyes no longer downcast. They were rebuilding more than just their storefronts. They were rebuilding their community, founded now on a shared moment of courage rather than a shared silence of fear. Elias did not ride off into the sunset. The open road held no more appeal for a man who had finally found a place to stand his ground. He stayed, taking a job at the livery, his hands finding a simple, honest purpose in the care of horses. He spoke little of his past, but he no longer carried it like a shroud. The ghosts of the Washita were still there, but they were quieter now, their whispers drowned out by the sounds of a town coming back to life. He had found his redemption not in a grand gesture, but in the steady, daily choice to be a good man. Kiona and her family kept their land. The deed, it turned out, was ironclad. Blackwood's claims nothing but bluster and forged documents. She would often ride into town, not as an outcast, but as a respected neighbor. She and Elias never spoke of the chase through the Badlands or the confession in the cave. They didn't have to. Their bond was forged in a silence deeper than words, in a shared understanding of survival and sacrifice. Sometimes, they would simply sit on the porch of the livery as the sun went down, watching the colors bleed across the vast Oklahoma sky. Two solitary figures who had found an unlikely peace in one another's company. Their story became a quiet legend, a reminder that the West was not only won by rifles and railroads, but by the fierce, unyielding spirit of those who refuse to be broken. It taught that honor is not a thing you are born with, but a thing you build, action by action, and that true strength is not the power to dominate, but the courage to stand for what is right, even when you stand alone.